The quote from you is this: "I left Homebush on the night of the closing ceremony, the Olympic Games, uncertain whether I had just seen the beginning of something new or the concluding fireworks of the period of reform and ambition of Australia in the 1980s and 90s." And it struck me, it crystallised for me something I had felt as well. The question I have really is, do you have greater certainty now, 10 years later? I mean, is that period kind of finished? I mean, that period of creativity, which you also, interestingly, think the arts reflects, that there's a connection between vibrancy in the arts and vibrancy in national cultures.
Yeah. Well, it was such a big event, you didn't quite, at the time, know what to think of it, but I had the inkling, this is the end of the great period, not the beginning of a new one, you know. And this just proved to be too true, because the economic reform stopped, the social debate regressed, and we've now sort of ended where we are. I mean, we've got this tremendous economic structure around us which has looked after us, but we're kind of lost, you know, lost. And I was hoping that wouldn't be true, but as it turned out, the Olympics was the high point. It was
of that sort of cultural vibrancy,
of that, yeah, of the cultural vibrancy of Australia as an international standout place, as a sort of leitmotif for its internationalism. Yeah.
Now, I take it, I'm just making a joke, I take it that you weren't a great admirer of the Howard foreign policy. At one point you say it was like nestling in the armpit of Uncle Sam. Not exactly a flattering image. And then another thing about that, which I would like you to say something about, is, to me, very interesting. You say in the book, not only have you not gone to Galipoli, but you never will. You are, however, famous for having kissed the earth at Kokoda. How do these symbols stand in your mind? I mean, why never go to Gallipoli? Why just Kokoda?
Yeah. Well, you know, the great period of Australian nationalism, from the birth, you know, the federation, the whole sense of a nation, the birth of the Labor Party, which was part of it, all died in 1914, all stopped in 1914. And the Tories came back and took over the morning, you know, in 1918 with Hughes, and carried it all the way through. The whole Anzac tradition was more or less heisted by them, you know. But I make the point in the book about patriotism and nationalism.
Yeah.
This is really important, you know. Patriotism is inclusive and invariably kind. Nationalism is an altogether different thing. It's exclusionary and selfish. It's all about the sense of, like I'll give an example. In German they used to call it the Volk, the V-O-L-K, but the Volk didn't mean the people. If we translate Volk, it means people, but it didn't mean the people, it meant a certain kind of people. The people that had the inner sense of the nation, you know. Therefore, I make the point in the book, I'm a patriot, I'm not a nationalist, where I think Howard is a nationalist, not a patriot. That's not to say he doesn't have what we call patriotic instincts, he does. And fundamentally, Gallipoli was more of an exercise in nationalism, though not exclusively, whereas Kokoda was definitely an exercise in patriotism. You know, our boys up there fighting the best of the Japanese in the defence of Australia for all we had created here. And it's just dreadful that the RSL and the Liberal Party and the nationalists, as they call themselves before it, would never accept the importance of the role of Australia and Australian troops in the Second World War. It was always about the First World War. It was always about Gallipoli and Flanders and the First World War. And so what I wanted to do as Prime Minister was to say that the battle for Australia, as Keating called it, the battle for Australia was first fought in Papua New Guinea, and this was an exercise in national survival, but in patriotism, and that there is a difference between the two. And so therefore I'm stretching a point to say that Gallipoli is purely an exercise in nationalism, because many of our boys who went and died there would have felt the full sense of patriotism here. But the fact that they were conscripted to go to a hopeless campaign, as Graham Freudenberg said in his book, the most important Prime Minister outside of Churchill in the 20th century in Britain was Asquith. The Admiralty Minister was Churchill, and the Commander-in-Chief was Haig, I think. Kitchener. They had the three best people in Britain.
The best minds in.
But they gave us Gallipoli. Yeah. So therefore, going rah, 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 this is us, My point is that the Australian nation didn't have to find its soul in Gallipoli. It had a soul beforehand, has a soul since.
Yeah.
And therefore I won't be part of the incantation,
Yeah. Now, this will be my final question about Australia. I have to say the book is very discreet in the sense that it seems to me you don't take shots at those who've succeeded you in the Labor Party at all. But I do want to ask you something about what's happened to Labor. You say quite often that Labor is the party that achieves things and builds community. I just wonder whether you think since in the last few years Labor has lost its way. I'm sure a lot of people in this audience are thinking that that's the case, and that they've been puzzled by the trajectory of Labor, even in office since 2007. So I don't want to get you into indiscretion, but nevertheless I'm interested in what you think about where Labor now stands in the national story.
Well, Labor hasn't lost its soul, but it has lost its story. I think that, Bill Kelty and I were discussing this subject not that long ago, and we were just talking about what's Labor good at, what does it do well. It does the transitions well. Curtin and Chifley did the transition out of the war to the wartime, the post-war economy. The fact that old dandy Menzies inherited it is just as bad luck for us, Then you've got the transition out of the old closed, declining industrial protective culture of the so-called Australian defence model, later called the Australian settlement, and the transition to the new economy was done by us, by the Labor Party. Labor Party saved Australia a couple of times, important times. This is another transition. This is perhaps the biggest transition in 300 years. This is the transition to the establishment of China's position of primacy again in the international system. A change in the way the world works from west to east. And we are located in it. Here we are a primary exporter to this. Our continent sits in the East Asian hemisphere, and therefore the country is again in transition, and the very evidence of the transition is the effect that the mineral boom is having on the eastern states, and particularly Melbourne and Sydney. So therefore it's not beyond the wit of the Labor Party, shouldn't be, to construct a story of transition and to see everything they're doing in it in the story, like the carbon tax, like the mining tax. It shouldn't. When Twiggy Forrest set up Fortescue Metals, it's not long ago, it's 8-9 years ago, iron ore was $20 a tonne. Until recently it was 160, it's now 130. Is it too much to ask that the Australian public should have a part of it? It's not. Therefore, the mining tax is a completely valid thing,
yes,
as is the carbon abatement scheme. But it should be it should be all part of the transition, and the transition's also got to be a cultural one.
And it has to be a story.
It's got to be a story, and I think there's got to be the psychological wish to be part of the growth of this part of the world,
yeah,
to be part in it. I say over and over in the book, Australia must find its security in Asia, not from Asia, you know. And Howard tried to pretend we could find our security from Asia by doing out the Americans bidding in Iraq or doing some, you know, our security can only be found, look, in a country of 20 million people, 20 odd million, we must be in coalitions. The unilateralist option is not for us. We're not big enough to exercise the unilateralist option. We don't have the power. We must be in coalition and coalition building. Around this part of the world, we were great at this. The APEC leaders meeting, the Cambodia peace accords, the ASEAN regional forum, we did all this stuff. This is the game, but it seems now that we don't want to really be, I mean, let me be fair to Kevin Rudd, he's talking about as Foreign Minister and as Prime Minister an Asia-Pacific community. He is talking about that. But psychologically the show isn't talking about it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So therefore, the great challenge for the Labor Party is to realign, get the psychological thing together, and in doing that, they'd have a lot of people back from the Greens. You know,
yeah,
those people that used to support Bob and me would be back. But whatever, it's just shooting stars, you know, mining tax here and a carbon tax there and something else there, but no storyline. Then the end result is you get where they found themselves.
Now, I'm going to ask just 2 or 3 more questions because we've been talking a fair while. I would love to go on for many hours, but there are constraints. It struck me in reading the book, there's a lot on, which is not about Australia but about the world. It struck me as a deeply non-provincial book, a book which sees the world, and perhaps the biggest story, and you've adverted to it once or twice already, that you see us living in an extraordinary period of transition in world history as the period basically away from the dominance of European societies and societies that are based on European models like the United States and Australia and so on, to a world in which at least there will be equality between the European societies and Asian societies. And you say, for example, about China that it's the most astonishing thing almost in the history of the world economy that a country has risen so quickly. What strikes me about it is how, I know, for example, that Malcolm Fraser sees things in that way, and I think there are some Australians who understand the larger world picture, but how limited it is in national politics at the moment, the sense that we're living through something really extraordinary. I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about that, because it seems to me that having a non-provincial vision of things is rather important at the moment if we're going to get things right.
Well, Robert, the core of the book is about the world. It's not about, you know, parochial conversations. It is about the world. I mean, I suppose if I had to find a central thesis for it, it is this, that at the end of the most successful policy the Americans ever employed, liberal internationalism, which seen them stare down the Soviet Union and end up with a victory in 1989, they walked off the field the moment the wall came down. They had developed no organising principle for the world at the end of the Cold War. Yet all these former colonial states like India, Indonesia, Vietnam, China, should have been growing in all of the post-war years, but their growth was stunted by the freezing bipolarity of the Cold War. When the Cold War finished, open regionalism became a possibility. And in the thawing, these great states started to take off. So if you were the United States, you would have said, right, we've had this victory, but now we're running a new but better world, a more representative world, and indeed even a world we may not be able to run. But at least let's get out there with a structure, an organising structure. What I say in the book is that the 2 Clinton terms and the 2 George W. Bush terms were completely wasted in reshaping the world at the end of the Cold War. 16 years, the United States went into a period under Clinton of triumphalism and the dot-com boom, and blew out in 2000. And then, of course, the refugees from the Reagan administration come back with George W. and adopt a policy of exceptionalism, of unilateralism, rejecting at the wrong moment all the success of liberal internationalism. And then Osama bin Laden draws the big red herring across the trail and they run off to Afghanistan and to Iraq. Meanwhile, the big colossus is rising in China. You see, India coming out of its sort of post-Soviet period, Indonesia growing again, and then what happens is nothing happens. It just all goes on. The fact is the world is unled. And the G20, which has just finished, people are saying, oh, the G20 is disappointing. The G20 was called as a creditors meeting. When they met when Gordon Brown pulled that meeting together with the support of, firstly by George W. Bush in the middle of the crisis in 2008, and then by Gordon Brown in 2009 with the support of President Obama, it was to have the debtor states and the creditor states in the one room. It was never the Americans saying, we're turning over a new leaf. The world has changed. The power of the world has shifted from west to east, and we are now going to do what we can to develop a much more representative world structure. This hasn't happened. And you saw again, the thing flopped again on the weekend. A G20 meeting flopped again on the weekend. So the world's just sort of drifted along, and I make the points about Russia. Russia is the only state in the world with the capacity to obliterate the United States. Obliterate it. So therefore, if you were US, you would have a policy towards Russia. And when Gorbachev agreed magnanimously and Yeltsin to take the wall down and to have a united Germany and NATO, you would be bringing Russia into the European construct. No, not them. Bill Clinton allows Hungary, Poland and the Czech Republic to join NATO, so they take NATO's border right up to the western border of the Ukraine. And then George W. Bush says, I've got an even better idea, I'll put a national missile defence shield right around their backyard, So, of course, they've created Putin. And now Putin's now talking about a Eurasian Federation of States. So the US has sort of lost it, they lost the thing. Now, and in the middle of this, we're stuck with nuclear weapons. There's a speech in there I gave at the University of New South Wales about, I set up the Canberra Commission in 1995, the first Western government ever to say, let's get rid of nuclear weapons. We had the best people in the world on the commission, including the guy who the previous year was the head of US Strategic Command, General Lee Butler. It's still the basic denuking document. It was actually presented to Howard. Of course, Howard and Down did nothing with it, nothing at all.
They called it a stunt.
They called it a stunt. So we lost the great opportunity of getting rid of nukes. The West gave the world nuclear weapons, so the West was in a position to take them away. Now, of course, Israel has them, Pakistan has them, India has them, Iran may have them, North Korea has them, etc., outside of the main five. So there's a huge mistake, let's not use the word mistake, a huge lost opportunity. And this has changed the way the world now is. The Chinese have worked all this out. And they're not going to be run by the United States anymore. They're not going to be in that. They're not going to be run by the IMF, etc. So the book in many respects focuses on this. Every couple of years I write about this, saying, look at this is such a shame. Yet I was, despite a bit of discussion with the Americans from time to time, you could never quite get them to see. I could see China coming in 1990, 91. You know, China was nothing in 91, but you could see it coming. So the book is about that, is about how the world will be and how we ought to be setting up organising principles for its management, how it should be led in a construct, and how we could be part of it.
Now, we've gone on for a good time. I think we should open the audience. If that's all right.
Do a few more if you like. I'm quite happy. A few more questions. I like Victorians, let me tell you. In 1996, I got a majority of votes and a majority of seats in Victoria.
So we'll have a few questions, and then I'll make a couple of remarks to conclude. Is there anyone like to?
I just want to say a pleasure to have you here today, Mr. Keating, and thank you for laying the foundations for our nation's enduring prosperity. Many have described your prime ministership as an unfinished revolution. My question is, if you were prime minister today, what would you do, and what do you think needs to be done to advance Australia to its next stage of development? Thank you very much.
The biggest single challenge is to have Australia psychologically wish to be part of the region around it. That is, wanting to be in it, and that means feeling comfortable with these societies around us, learning the languages. We were teaching them in the 1990s. A lot of it stopped. Bahasa, various dialects around the region, and not fearing it, to want to be there. So in other words, it's fundamentally a big re-education task. That's the most important thing now. It was well and truly rolling in the 80s and 90s, but it's gone into a hollow. That's the one I think is most important.
Thank you very much.
Yes, my question goes just a little bit further. If you subscribe to the idea that being a parliamentary career is not necessarily something that should happen in continuity, what would you think of the premise of having another crack, actually? Having another crack of coming back in, you know, because in some European countries, parliamentarians... I can give you examples of parliamentary democracies in Europe where somebody's been Prime Minister, goes out, comes back as Prime Minister, and even in some cases, you know, and that's another story, Prime Ministers don't necessarily have to be elected MPs.
Well, look, thank you for the compliment. I think, there's a certain time, in military aircraft, we have this expression, they have a certain, what they call dash capability. That's to get into a target and do something and then get out again. And I think in public life, we all have a certain dash capability. Dash it, I think mine's over.
What is the role of reciprocity in our engagement with Asia? How should Australia be engaging with Asia when many Asian governments aren't yet inclusive of their own citizens fully?
Well, this is one of the things I think we have to live with. That is, people, as these societies become wealthier, they'll demand their own say. You can see this in China today. The biggest problem the Chinese face is the issue of the control of the party vis-a-vis the wishes of the population. I mean, the story of modern China is fundamentally a story of urbanisation, and urban areas are full of people, and their incomes normally go up, and they can talk to one another. So there's occasions for their discussions, their congregation. This is putting enormous pressure on the party in China. And it is in other parts of Asia. But the idea that we are exporters of Jeffersonian democracy and that we have the answers on the human rights, and if they don't measure up to it, well, they can just get out, which is the sort of Sydney Morning Herald line, the age line, these sort of puny little journos who've never really been to these, never really understood what these massive lifting 1 billion people out of poverty, what that entails. Therefore, we have to be Australians, be what we are, with our values, and not surrender those values to anybody, to propagate those values by all means, but still be useful interlocutors in the region. Now, the great challenge for us in this part of the world is to watch the change in the strategic balance in North Asia. At the moment, of course, we've all enjoyed the protection of the United States as a strategic guarantor of Japan, of South Korea, of the Philippines, of Australia. All of a sudden, this great state rises. The great tragedy will be if we try and do to China what Russia, France, and Britain did to Bismarck's creation. In Germany at the end of the 19th century, it will be catastrophic for us. The moment Britain and Russia and France signed their Entente Cordiale, so-called, in 1895, and in 1904 Britain joined them. From that moment on, the march was on to the First World War. What we have to do around here is keep the structure not rigid, not bipolar. Therefore, Henry Kissinger makes the point too in his latest book, the flexibility of diplomacy, the ability of diplomacy to play a role in a construct of a group of nations, a concert of powers in Asia, not a balance of power, a concert of power, not a balance of power, is the most pressing requirement in our national debate. That is, how do we keep Asia fluid? How do we convince the Americans that they've got to give strategic room to China? All great states claim strategic space, and if you don't give it to them, they take it. You know, US took it from Britain, Germany took it from Britain, and the rest of Europe in the First World War. Hitler tried to do it again in the Second World War. The Russians did it after the Second World War. The United States, of course, has done it everywhere. And of course the Chinese will too. Therefore, for us, one of the useful things a middle power like Australia can do is to construct a debate in the region which allows a transition of power, the recognition of China's rise, but having it as part of a concert of nations and a concert of power in the area, with a healthy debate running between us, with transparency and openness and regard. That's the great challenge. The challenge is not to look down our nose at them and preach to them about human rights. You can do that. But what is the practical outcome of the policy? You know, the primary things matter most, and that is trying to construct that kind of diplomatic flexibility in a period of great change. I mean, the Americans now are trying to exit Iraq quickly to get back to now the Pacific. The United States has got to look after two oceans. It's got to look after the Atlantic and it's got to look after the Pacific. China doesn't have to look after the Atlantic at all. It's only got part of the Pacific, North Asia, and it will claim strategic space. So therefore, accommodating China in a new construct is really hugely important and the most important thing facing Australia.
Mr. Keating, my name's Mary Speck. I'm here from The Age. Sorry.
We'll have time for, I think, 2 questions there, but I think, is there one up the back?
And one here. I was first.
First is best.
Mr. Keating, I'm up here.
Oh,
there you are.
it's hard to see from
sorry.
here.
Up the back on the right. I just want to say it's a privilege to be here. You were an inspiration to me when I did my social science degree at UTS, and the difference between your policy and John Howard's policy during the mid-90s on Indigenous issues led me to my honours thesis, and I interviewed Olga Havnen and Rick Farley, and it made a big influence on my life. But anyway, I just wanted to ask you, you said something before about how politicians claim they know what the public wants. And with social media these days, how do politicians and political parties know what the public wants?
Well, you know, my line is you don't necessarily give the public back what the public wants. You give them what the public needs. You know, if you give them too much of it, they get fed up with you. But you try to give them what they need. You know, I mean, there's a nice. I think there's a nice demonstration of the point someone made. This has been part of the commentary about the demise of Steve Jobs and Apple, and it's just as true of him as it is in public life. What he didn't do was to poll his customer base to see how he could improve his product or give them what they wanted. He gave them a completely new idea of something which they had not conceived, you see. And I think this is true in public life too. In the end, the key ingredient in a public life is imagination, you know. And you imagine something better, you try and bring people with you to get there. Sometimes you make it, sometimes you don't. The worst of it is to be subject to the response, the reactionary response of the polling and the conversation backwards and forwards. I still think the big ideas have their own currency and their own momentum. And it's in the absence of the bigger ideas, the big and truthful conversation, that all the static rises. The static's there while ever there is a void in the thing. So I don't believe that social media is going to displace the big national conversation, but it will certainly displace it while ever there isn't one.
Thanks. I'm interested to know what you see would be the logical steps for the current government to take in order to move out of the current mess that we have of asylum seeker policy and onto a more sensible footing.
Well, I'm not here to instruct the current government. We're here talking about things I've written over 15 years or so. But I've pretty much made my position clear. I think the idea that we have this vast continent, but we sort of close it up to the human community outside, or appear to close it up, is a bad thing for us to be seen to be doing. And the idea that we can sign up the refugee conventions, but we won't process people here. We'll have these subterfuges of sending them to Nauru or to Malaysia or someone else. I don't believe in those places. I believe in processing in Australia, and I believe in facing up to the fact that there's a lot of footloose people in the world. We don't share a border with any one country. If you were Germany, with I think there's 8 states around it, imagine how porous your border would be, or even the porous border between Mexico and the United States. We don't have that. We have relatively few people coming by boat. Most of the people who come to Australia illegally come on a visitor's visa through our main airports. That's how they come. And it's because that Howard was able to make the imagery of people coming in votes. They're coming to invade us, that idea. This debate's got going. But we've got to think not just about the political debate now, but the long-term debate. What do we do with a continent like this? What should be our position? Which principles do we adopt? How do we get along in the region? Or do we appear in the region to be simply selfish people who want to hang on to the place for ourselves? But more than that, where we actually have some sort of racial thing running as well. You know, this is, I think, very bad for us.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll take 2 more.
We'll just have time for 2 more questions.
Mr. Keating, up the top.
And,
both political parties have become so focused on electability, and it's become quite toxic, and we see well-meaning people enter politics and become compromised. As a Prime Minister who has seen this who is now seen retrospectively as the embodiment of principled governance, I suppose, to a certain degree. What would it take for a political culture to actually be more invigorated by ideas rather than electability?
Well, there are a lot of ideas. It's not true to say there are not ideas around, but I think what you need, I said it before about imagination. Imagination and courage are the two things that make up political leadership. And the big sweeps, you know, the big schematic is what we need. The other bits of the story will fall into place. They'll be there. But that does require absenting yourself from the sort of hourly news cycle. You know, I mean, I think leaders need time to think, and they need time to make the construct. Because a Prime Minister, for instance, or a senior minister, but a Prime Minister has a whole system to think about. It's very hard to think productively about the whole system, responding to 2 radio interviews a day and all the rest of the social chit-chat that goes on. So therefore, there's got to be a premium back on leadership and the officers. I think the political system is just now too much. I mean, I said the other day about the late line program, you know, ministers going on the late line program. I mean, it just drags the position of ministers in the government down. You know, they're sharing a program with people who've got no mandate for anything, you know. So therefore, the government having courage about what it is and what it stands for, what its prerogatives are, but more than that, what its responsibilities are, is the way to approach government again, not to be everything to all people, available for every ratso program. You go on, you know, every comment, everything, you know, which is where it is now. As a result, the whole system goes down and the ability to stand back and think and lead the place is jeopardised.
And the final question.
Thank you. Actually, it's a nice cycle. I'd like to bring it right back to the very start of the day when we had what was really a wonderful performance demonstrating the legacy of the Creative Nations program. You'd be acutely aware that Simon Crean's currently putting together the next national cultural policy. Would you have one thing that you'd like to see as a main agenda on that? And I'll give you a hint. My particular interest is the visual arts.
Yeah. Well, you know, you've heard me say, you may have read, the highest form of the arts is not the visual arts. The highest form of the arts is music. You know? Because in the end, the visual arts are representational. They're representing something else. They're trying to paint an image that an artist imagines, or they're trying to make a film about a circumstance which exists. Whereas in music, there's a creativity which didn't exist until it was created. In other words, it's not representational, it's true creativity. That doesn't invalidate the visual arts, let me say. But I think that, you know, Simon is a committed Australian, a great Labor minister, and more than that, he's always, to my knowledge, had this great interest in the arts. He understands that that the arts are central to a country. They're not peripheral, they are in fact central, and the more central they are, the more substantial the direction of the nation will be. So, therefore, I think you'll find from him, if I know him, a panoply of things which will be about things we excel in. The visual arts is one, of course. As in literature, as in, of course, music, as in generally the arts themselves. I don't know what I can say particularly about the visual arts that marks them out. They seem to me to have a fair bit of energy in Australia, I must say. The film industry, of course, has its better times and its not so good times. I'm not sure what the answer to that is. But one thing is for certain, I do think the Labor Party It's not to say that people in the Liberal Party or all people in the Liberal Party are either not interested in the arts or don't see its impact, but the Labor Party generally has a better understanding of the importance of the arts to the country than I think does our Conservative opponents. That's not to wish them badly, it's just that you wish them to come over to that side of the argument. So I don't know what else I can say. I look forward to Simon's statement.
I just want to say a couple of things. I inform you that Paul will be, I believe, signing copies of his book, which I'd recommend very highly indeed. Towards the end of the book, when speaking about the absence of leadership in today's world, Paul Keating says, I quote, "In the end, everyone in political life gets carried out. The only relevant question is whether the pallbearers will be crying." I wanted to assure you that, and I think this audience is testament to that, many Australians have been crying since 1996. But earlier on in the book, you quote something Winston Churchill, one of your heroes, once said to Violet Bonham Carter. I quote, "You know, Violet, in the end, we are all worms, but I do believe I am a glowworm." What Churchill said of himself, I feel confident I can say of you, Paul. You have been, in my view, a mighty glowworm in the history of this country, and for that you have all our thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.